Thanks a lot to Godrej Archives. Godrej Archives is quite, I think it's fair to say that it's the best archive in India across all genres that I've ever been to, and clearly on par with anything that I've seen outside India. So it's thanks to Vrinda for setting the standards very high in this field. And I spend a lot of time, and you'll see there's a lot of stuff in the book actually which comes from the Godrej Archives. Thanks a lot to Max Mueller, Bhavan, and I was a student of German in Mumbai for 2 years, and I used to go to the Parla office, but I had my Gates Y exam was out here, and I actually took the course in this very building, so it's very nice to come back to an institute where I studied. Now this book is the culmination of about 10 years of my research on a topic which intuitively everyone engages with, understands, almost all of us in the room, migrants or descendants of first or second generation migrants. Very few will be third or maybe fourth or fifth generation migrants. And I realized that this was such a fascinating story that had actually never been told in a coherent way. You have books on particular communities, you have books on particular regions, but actually no one book which just tries to tell the story across centuries, across communities, across regions in one place. And so what I'm going to take you through is just a flavor of the book. The books are available behind, and focus on some aspects, especially those which are very closely tied with my research. One, a concept called as the Great Indian Migration Wave, and two, the word that you see out here, business. So the business archive, since this is an event on business, something on the migration of business community. So I'll focus on those aspects and a bit more on various other themes. Now the book starts off many centuries ago. So the first question the book asks is, when we say India is a diverse country, is it a result of migration and intermingling, or is it a result of isolation? And you can have diversity from both these counts. So I start this book with this question. For example, we are very proud in India of having many languages, but a small archipelago like Papua New Guinea actually hosts more languages than India. And these are islands which never conversed with each other, and so each island developed uniquely with minimal contact between the islanders. So if you observe Papua New Guinea today, they are very diverse, but that's a result of actually no contact. And if you look at India today, it's very diverse, but is it a result of no contact? And historians, until the 1960s, actually believed this, that India was essentially living in its villages, and the village was a self-contained, self-sufficient unit with very little interactions with the outside world. Now, a lot of research which has happened over the last few years, decades, where historians have said, no, this is not the case. But just to give you a simple starting point of how flawed such an idea of Indian history of being self-contained in a village is to start with the most important migration, which is quantitatively the most voluminous migration, and that is migration of women for marriage, right? Every village in India is interconnected with another village or town or city through ties of marriage. And that's something which is not very well appreciated when you start thinking of migration, because you think of migration for work, migration for studies, but migration for marriage is actually the sort of hidden contour. And the Census of India, not surprisingly, counts over 300 million women. Virtually every adult woman in India is a migrant. Right? So when you start talking of migration, you realize that actually every Indian woman has been on the move, because the minute you cross the village boundary in the census, you're classified as a migrant. But it's not just crossing the village boundary and going to the next village. These migrations can involve substantial distances, including crossing linguistic boundaries, crossing regional boundaries. And so this is the starting point of the book. And so I look at a bit of the history of female migration. And so I track it through the ages. And it's very fascinating because norms on women's mobility have sort of changed over time, but also have been fairly restrictive. So if you look at Kautilya's Arthashastra, very specific views on who can move, which women can move. There are actually clear, sort of exhortations of women who can move. For example, cheerleaders for people who are fighting the war, they are allowed to go, right? But if a husband is asleep or drunk, the woman cannot leave the house. And so I recount all the stipulations which are there on women's mobility. That's the starting point, because this is the most important migration in terms of just sheer numbers. But if you look at this more basic sort of question of who we are as Indians, or where do we come from, the answer today is sort of addressed by a combination of evidence coming from languages, which was originally the principal evidence, but also from genetics. And just a few weeks back, I met the leading exponent of this, guy called David Reich at Harvard, and he's got a book out just this year, also with Penguin, on the history of humanity, which is a fascinating book on ancient migrations. And that corroborates what we already know, that almost all, they're still contesting theories of who we are, as where did we come from? Did we come from China? Did we come from Central Europe? Did we come from Africa? But there's no doubt that almost all of, everyone in this room is hybrid. That means we are, products of migrations coming from a variety of different channels, somewhere around Africa, if you go in the very, very deep past. But even if you look at 10,000 years, it's coming from different channels across, especially Central Asia. That's the leading theory. Now, when you look at migration in ancient Indian history, there's actually not much evidence of systematic migration. Of course, the epics are very clear. The central ideas in both the famous epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, is of exile and return. Right? So that's a very, very central, important sort of theme, and I'll come to that when we talk of this great Indian migration wave. But the very direct reference on migration in Indian history comes in the first millennium, which is a social group called the Brahmanas. And in a way, if you look at what is Hindu philosophy, Hinduism as a religion, comes across because of the migration of this social group across the subcontinent. And so it is this migration in the second half of the first millennium for which we actually have clear evidence of land grants, kingdoms actually telling this social group to move and settle and sort of collect taxes from that region and sort of give it back. I also recount the migration of artisans, weavers. There's a very famous community in Tamil Nadu called the Madurai Saurashtras. And even today in their wedding ceremonies, they begin the wedding ceremony by recounting how their migration histories. So they say, my ancestors migrated from here to here, here to here, here to here. And then the woman's family has to recount the same thing. So migration is also embedded in not only folk songs, but also marriage rituals. It's such a strong part of a variety of communities in India. But if you cut to the Mughal period, one way of understanding, Mughal history is invasion, which is very popular these days. But it could also be seen as a refugee crisis, right? And so when you look at the larger backdrop of this migration, it turns out that actually a lot of these guys were fleeing the violence in Central Asia and coming to India pretty much out of no choice. If you read, Babur Nama, most famously, he was homesick, never wanted to be in India, always wanted to go back. And so if you look at the Mughal sort of influx in India, or the Persian influx in India, a lot of it comes out to be, one interpretation of this movement was one of massive refugee crisis as part of global migrations happening across what you would call as the steppe region and Europe. So if the first wave of mass migrations were from global sources, even the second source of massive sort of influx coming from the northwest is also a result of not just something happening from Persia to India, but as a result of much larger global movements happening across the world meaning, forget the Americas for a minute, but just the larger sort of trans-European region. Now, in this time, you also had slaves. And so there's a whole section on the book on slaves. And we often think of slavery as a very American institution. And it's a very defining moment in American history. But I recount what we know about slavery in Indian history. But some of the most remarkable aspects, and I'll just start with this one picture, is one of the first sort of paintings that we have from the sort of Jahangir's period. And this is a person called Malik Amber. And he's a sort of real arch rival of Jahangir. He was born in what we would call as Ethiopia today. Even constructing the history of this character is one of the great achievements of historians in the last 30 years, especially a historian by the name Richard Eaton. Because he connected different archives across different continents to tell us the story of this person. But his story is that he's a person born in Ethiopia. He's sold then to Arabia. And from the slave markets of Arabia, he's actually brought into the Deccan, which was a fairly common phenomenon by the time he came in. So he was taken in by a person who was already black African and a noble. And in his own lifetime, he grew up to be one of the leading people of the nobility in the Deccan kingdoms. Right? Not a king, but almost a king. And this is a remarkable story of a slave turned noble, which was fairly common in this particular period of the 16th and 17th centuries. And The descendants of this community still exist. Different parts of Western India known as different names, but in Ahmedabad, for example, in Gujarat, known as the Hapshis, known as the Siddhis. And the logo of my institution, for example, IIMA, it's a very intricate, the Siddhi side, the Jali, comes from the descendants of these people. Right? So this is a remarkable story of how a person from Ethiopia can influence the logo of India's leading business school. Now, when you come a bit sort of closer, this is a picture of the first migrants who reached Mauritius, in 1834, the hill coolies. This is not, many people think of 1834 as the defining date where people started, the colonial empire started sort of recruiting people in a large way. It's not true, and I recount the history of slavery before 1834. But what is true is that what the British did was to start organized recruitment. In 1834, in just small numbers, and then later on in slightly more larger numbers, but really the bulk of the recruitment took place in the late 19th century. And by then, the bulk of the recruitment was not on indenture. So we often think of, if you think of phases of migration history in India, you start off with this Aryan migration hypothesis, and then you cut to the 19th century indentured migration. In between, there's as if nothing ever happened. But even this indentured migration, quantitatively speaking, was a really small fraction of what was happening in the 19th century. And so in the 19th century, Indian people start moving, mostly voluntary, as part of a much more sort of global phenomenon happening at that time. Triggered by improvements in technology, the railways being the principal mover internally, but also the steamboats. Now, what the British do is very interesting. Compared to previous rulers, they not only increase mobility, like this, a person from rural eastern Uttar Pradesh coming to Mauritius, unheard of before the British, but they also decrease mobility. And this is two contrasting things that the colonial empire achieves, the British colonial empire. And they do this because the groups which were historically always mobile, especially the nomadic groups, the Banjaras, for example, who provided logistical equipments to armies and so on, were forced to settle down because the British they had this policy of surveillance and they couldn't understand how to handle mobile groups. And this led to a lot of impoverishment of a particular social group, which we see it even today. It's also embedded in terminology. Criminal tribes, notified tribes, NTs is a word we use even today in Maharashtra, for example. And a lot of this comes because they sort of reduce mobility. And what's interesting is some of these communities were displaced by the railways, but they ended up working on the railways because as porters, for example, right? So they were in a way they were working on the platform of the technology which displaced them. This is a very interesting image. This is to tell you the power of the railways. Different modes of travel. So you have people walking, but that is, it says below that, Hindu pilgrim. Then you have horse, the palki, the cart, and of course the elephant. And then this is a picture from the Illustrated Weekly in London. And then you have the grand arrival of the train. Right? So the train is supposed to herald this mass mobility. The way I look at it is, the railways was very important to increase the speed of the continent. So for about 2,000 years, the fastest way to move across the continent was the horse. And so from the 1850s, from pretty much where we are now, the Thane line, the speed increases tremendously. So internal mobility increases tremendously. But as I noted, there were also various subgroups which were actually dismantled, which were moving a lot before, but actually started moving much, much less. I also argue that the railways was not actually the most important public institution. It started off privately, but then eventually public. It was not the most important public institution for migrants. That distinction falls to the post office. Because from 1880, they launched this thing called as the postal money order. And the money order, there's a whole section in the book on the history of the money orders, was the most remarkable financial instrument which helped migrant workers work at a distance. It was also, in a way, the first financial instrument used by masses, because it was used even before savings deposits, banks, and a variety of things. Okay. Which gets me to the 20th century. And I'll keep going across centuries in different sort of themes. But this is a family from Ratnagiri. And I'll talk a bit about Ratnagiri because I've also done a lot of field work there. If any of you know Bombay's history, you'll know that a large part of the industrial workforce came from Ratnagiri. Even today, Ratnagiri sustains huge connections with Mumbai. When I went to Ratnagiri, I was surprised to find village names such as Dadar and Borivali in Ratnagiri. So I don't know which way the names moved, whether they moved from Ratnagiri to Bombay or vice versa. But this is a particular family. I met this gentleman. He's now in his 80s, and I'm not disclosing his name because he asked me not to. But he took this photo in Chembur. He was working as a security sort of officer at the port. And what's interesting is that it is only in this photograph that you see the women of his family, because they came for one holiday, they got the photograph clicked, and then they went back. But otherwise, he spent 35 to 40 years in Bombay, pretty much alone, and then his sons came in, but the women never moved. Okay? And this, I argue, is one remarkable sort of pattern of migration in India, which I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave. And I argue that the Great Indian Migration Wave, which is semi-permanent, people are not moving seasonally or permanently. They work for 10 months outside, but they never settle. They almost always settle or go back. It's remittance-based, because they're sending a lot of money back while they're there, and it's male-dominated. These three features characterize this migration wave. It affects more than 20% of India in terms of regions. If you calculate the district populations, that's over 200 million people affected by this wave, and it has been affected since at least the 1870s in magnitudes which are practically unimaginable for people who work with migration data. Just to put this particular episode of migration in global migration history, the only comparable migration is the urbanization of China, which is happening today. But that started pretty much from the 1980s. So it's a much shorter duration. You have the transatlantic slave trade, which was much more coerced, much longer, again, smaller magnitudes. You have the age of mass migration from Europe to Americas. 50 million people moved within about 50 to 70 years. These numbers exceed that, and the duration. Okay. And the reason to give this particular title is because in India we often take migration either for granted, or we are not aware of the very in a way rich migration history that is shaping our cities, shaping our world in India. And I argue that you can't understand modern Indian history without understanding the Great Indian Migration Wave. I'll give you the geography of this migration in a bit. But this is another family that was from Ratnagiri. This is a family from Udupi. Udupi, any of you who've eaten a South Indian restaurant in Mumbai would know what is Udupi. They are practically known as Udupi restaurants. And this is also, you might not know that the guys working the restaurants never actually settled in Bombay. They'll work their entire lives here, but they'll go back to their village. In case the woman comes, in case the husband dies, the woman will also go back to the village. Okay. This is a particular family which actually did settle in Mumbai. The eldest person out here, was in the freedom movement, but he died. And then the woman out in the picture, the elder woman, had a choice whether to go back or to stay. In this event, she chose to, stay out here and raise her family. And as it turns out, this is, my own family, right? So that's my grandfather, and that's, my grandmother. And you'll see my father, who's in the bow. He's been photoshopped in the picture because they didn't have a photograph of him in the picture. So the bottom right, and so he wasn't born then, but he wanted to be in the photograph. So, so they photoshopped him from some other picture onto that, right? But this is in Shivaji Park in the 1960s. And what's interesting is this is right in the building next to Bal Thackeray's building in Shivaji Park. And during the 1960s, anti-South Indian violence, which I document in the book, one of the interesting implications of that was that we changed our surname to make it sound more Maharashtrian. So Tumbe sounds Maharashtrian, but it's actually a village in Udupi, right? So we owe our surname to the most anti-migrant sort of a person who has ever lived in Mumbai. But just to show the extent of this migration, I'm going to show you only one statistic, and that's this. So no more statistics after this. The bottom line shows you years. So census years from 1901 to 2011. And the y-axis is the sex ratio. That is the females per 1,000 males. And all of you must have heard of Amartya Sen's missing women. Right? So India has this issue of missing women, which is very clear, especially in Punjab, Haryana, where sex ratios are something like 700, maybe 800, women to 1,000 males. Here's a story of the missing men. In Udupi, you've never had a sex ratio below 1100 females to 1000 males. Ratnagiri and Udupi are the stories of the missing men because these districts have always sent people outside. But notice the graph. It starts from 1901. In fact, it starts from 1870 because I have the data from the first census, which took place in 1870. But if you take it across, you see India, which is somewhere else, and you see this, it's a completely different world altogether. So this is what I mean by the story of migration persistence. To put it in perspective, almost 1 in 3 households has been sending somebody outside for work, etc., for more than 100 years. Okay? And this is not just Udupi and Ratnagiri. This is pretty much all the dark shaded regions of India that you see here. On one side of the Western Ghats from Kanyakumari to Ratnagiri. So when you think of Kerala migration as being something, something remarkable, it's not. It's actually a connecting body, and all of them started with migrations to Mumbai. So even Goa was a remittance economy until very, very recently. Even today, there are blocks in Goa, if you go to Bardes, Salsette, where a third of the households are receiving remittances from outside. Okay, and most of those people are working in the merchant navy. So this is the west coast of India. Now what's interesting is the west coast of India is also one of the richest parts of India today. If you thought of Ratnagiri as a poor place, it's not. Okay, if you thought of any part of this west coast as a poor place, on almost any human development indicator within India, they would rank very high. But even today, people are moving. So this is not a story of poverty driving migration, even though it might have been at a particular time and place. And then there are other parts of India. There's a district in Tamil Nadu called Sivaganga. Virtually every part of India has 1 or 2 district clusters which emerge and have sustained. Now, the way these clusters emerge is very fascinating, and I document this in this book, but I'll just tell you one example of Saran. You'll realize the biggest cluster comes from a region we all know very well, that is Eastern UP and Western Bihar. Right? So if you step outside this building, you're going to meet, a high chance that you're going to meet a person from not just anywhere in UP, but Eastern, that's the Bhojpuri speaking belt. Right? So that's why it cuts across Eastern UP and Western Bihar. And if you look at Saran district, which is one district, I trace its continuous migration history all the way back to the 15th century. And it starts from military recruitment. It started from military recruitment even for Ratnagiri. People first supplied, the Maratha caste, for example, first supplied warriors for Shivaji. And then the Bombay police. Even today, the Bombay police is almost completely staffed by the Marathas. Right? There are a lot of intricate caste connections, which I document in the book. When we did a village restudy spanning over 50 years, we looked at how the lower castes have actually caught up in terms of migration, out-migration intensities have caught up to the upper castes over the last 50 years, and how now pretty much everyone is moving. So in Ratnagiri, the 2 main castes are Marathas and Mahars, and all of them are moving. Not much has changed in terms of intergroup inequality, but absolute poverty has pretty much vanished. So nobody is poor, but in terms of relative inequality, we find that not much has changed. So not much has changed in terms of land ownership, but there's a lot of the book documents how identities have been reshaped with these migrations. Just to tell you also the Himalayan economy, which extends into Nepal, that includes Uttarakhand, parts of Himachal, and then there's this one block in Rajasthan, which is a bit more recent. It doesn't start all the way back, but that one cluster right on top is pretty much the cluster that you talk about as being the Marwadis. Right? But Marwar as a place is west of Rajasthan, but Marwadi is a misnomer. Most Marwadis that you go meet outside Rajasthan actually come from Shekhawat. So they should be called Shekhawatis, but it's just a sort of slate of history that we call them Marwadis. Okay? But most of them come from that particular Churu, Hanumangarh district. The Sivaganga district in the south is also home to the Chettiar community, and I'll talk about them in just a minute. So this gives you an idea. If you add up the populations of all the black shaded districts here, that's more than 20% of India. If you add the cities of Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, Surat, which are in a way the magnets of many of these migrants, if you add up the Gulf population, more than 5 million Indians in the Gulf who are coming from the west coast, right? And the interesting thing out here is that, one of the things methodologically that I did in my study was to not create this binary between internal and international migration. Like, for example, Ganjam is a district which I mentioned in the book on the east coast of Odisha. And 100 years back, there was mass migration to Burma. So think of Burma as being the Gulf of India 100 years back. Everyone went to Burma. But once that closed, and I talk about why it closed, people started switching. And from just that one district on Ganjam, everyone started moving west towards Gujarat, and today most of them work in Surat. I did a lot of my research in Surat, often in trains, on railway platforms, and it's interesting to see how these networks change over time. But what's interesting is the persistence. In the case of, I also document why is this happening. In the case of Saran, it's very simple. It's very dense. Flooding is, common issue. In the case of Ganjam, it's very simple. It's just what I call as a cyclone psychology. There's been a super cyclone in that region practically every 10 or 15 years. So migration, and if you've seen the movie Gaman, a very classic Hindi movie called Gaman, and all the insecurities associated with migration, those are actually far less than many of the variabilities that one faces back home in many of these regions. For example, in coastal Orissa, the super cyclone, which people almost know now will come once in 10 or 15 years. So migration then is a very sustainable strategy compared or relative to what other things are happening. So this is the Great Indian Migration Wave. Some districts have prospered tremendously. Udupi is now the second richest district of India. So I also look at why some of these districts have used migration and prospered and why some have not. And the key out there seems to lie in education. You'll remember George Fernandez, one of the most famous exports from the coastal Karnataka wave. But one of the things that movement did was the Udupi migrant workers, they just didn't work in the restaurants. They opened night schools in Bombay. Right? And so they educated the next four. And so each generation was getting slightly better than the earlier one. Whereas in Saran and Bihar, you don't see that sort of generational shifts happening in education. And as a result of which, even today, the returns to migration don't seem to have changed that much. Now, the third chapter of the book looks at the migration of capital. So what I talked about earlier was the migration of labor, which also has very deep roots in certain senses. But this is just to give you a map of India, which sort of puts in larger font all the principal business communities of India. And in the book, I talk about 5 or 6 of the principal business communities. So there's a section in this chapter on the Parsis, of which Godrej is also mentioned as one of the most famous firms, the Marwadis, the Gujaratis, the Sindhis, the Punjabis, and the Chettiars. And also the Baghdadi Jews, like the Sassoons, of which the library is just across this particular building. In fact, it's mentioned in the book, the Sassoon Library. Now, what's interesting for me out here is why almost all these communities, just to give an idea of why the story matters, why even tell this story. This story matters for business history. It matters because even today, if you look at the top 100 richest people of India, 70% of them belong to these communities. Right? If you look at the top managers of India, if you look at the corporate managers of if you look at the directors of 1,000 largest firms of India, 45% still come from these communities. 45% are also just Brahmin. Okay, so 90% of corporate directors of the 1,000 largest firms of India belong to social groups which comprise less than 10% of India's population. Right? And you can't understand such phenomenon without understanding the cultivation of migration networks, which I talk about in this chapter. Now, in the case of Parsis, of course, we know there's a rich chronicle of Parsi migration. I'm not going to talk so much of that. But what's interesting is anyone who's aware of Bombay's history would know that it went through 2 phases of massive growth. One was fueled, of course, by narcotics, by opium, and the second was then cotton. Right? And all communities at any given point of time did dabble in some amount of opium and then moved on to cotton, jute, and all the other commodities which came by the late 19th century. I look at the Marwadis very closely because in this top 100 list, 30, the most from any community is actually Marwadis. Right? And so there's this whole description of how Marwadis have moved. A lot of this is based on my research. You might think that most Marwadis live in Calcutta or in maybe Bombay. So it turns out that most Marwadis as a region actually live in northern Maharashtra. Right? So it's in the towns of Dhule or towns of Jalgaon, towns of Nandurbar. When you add it up as a region, it's actually much, much more than the Marwadis of Calcutta or this region. And that's not a coincidence that this region of Maharashtra actually industrialized much faster because they provided important capital at a particular stage. If you look at the trajectories of West Bengal and Maharashtra, this is a very important reason of how these 2 different places are supplied by capital. There's also, of course, a lot of backlash against these communities. All communities face backlash, especially if you're doing well, and if others are not doing well, there's a natural sort of feeling. And the Marwadis probably faced the brunt of this crisis. You had the Deccan Revolt in 1875. In Calcutta, P.C. Ray, called them parasitic outsiders. And so all sorts of words given. I document the Times of India running an editorial in 1844 saying, beware of the Marwadis. 100 years later, of course, the firm was owned by a famous Marwadi group. So all these, opinions of communities being formed over 100 years. But for me, what's interesting is this question, why did all these communities come from one part of India? Right? You've realized that all of them are in the northwest. So whether it's the Parsis, or it's the Marwadis, or the Sindhis, or the Gujarati, for example, even the Kutchis, there's a whole section of the Kutchis, the only group which is outside this is the Chettiars. You can note that the Chettiars were in a way much richer than all these communities combined by the late 19th century because of the wealth accumulated in Southeast Asia. And so historians have supplied different reasons. The reason I offer is based on a particular attitude to migration itself, particular attitude to mobility. And so I look at a bit of the religious history and what religious texts had taboos. One of the deep taboos in Indian history is that of the Kalapani. I mean, one of the reasons why people didn't venture out in very far until very recent, until 100 years back, even in Gandhi's records, Gandhi had to convince his family that okay, I'm going outside, nothing will happen. In fact, in the Udupi Krishna Mutt, one of the when they had this priest changeover, the priest had gone to America, and then the other priest said, no, he's now disqualified because he's crossed the 7 seas. And so these notions actually are still even today sometimes fairly alive. I argue that actually all these groups actually belonged outside either Orthodox Hinduism or Orthodox Islam. Okay, and so in Gujarati you have this particular strand of Vaishnavism called Pushtimargi Vaishnavism, which evolves around the 16th century. Jainism is a very, very sort of rich history in Gujarat. The Parsis also had an outlook on trade, which is very, very different. And above all, the Punjabis. So the Sikh religion in a way grew through mercantile sort of patronage given by the Khatris. The Khatris were in a way the biggest diaspora of India. There were almost more than 50,000 of Khatris all the way towards Central Asia. So the whole description of this migration. And so I argue that this is a potential link. It still doesn't explain the complete story because then you have one big outlier, which is the Chettiars, which is down south. But the Chettiar history can be traced to a much more deeper history of trade with Southeast Asia, which has existed for a much longer time. But I argue that instead of looking at the other theory is that area is much drier, and so it's risk management has been traditionally a forte of people who live in dry areas. I feel that's not a full reason because a lot of India is semi-arid, dry. Much of northern Andhra Pradesh is also dry, semi-arid. But you don't see business groups coming out of these regions. So I feel that. So I argue why as to at a particular juncture in the 16th century. A lot of these social groups start moving out, and then based on whatever evidence is available, I track the migrations, and especially in the 20th century, for me, that's the fascinating story of how these groups moved across India. These groups then started moving outside India, and I did a lot of my work at the Godrej archives, tracking members of, I think there's one person, the Mancher Shah Godrej, who spent some time outside India. But in each family, you have one or two people, even in the Tatars, who started going outside India. Now, what's interesting about the history of Indian business outside India is that it all started from the diasporic network. So if today you see Bank of Baroda saying tagline is India's international bank, it's because they followed the Gujaratis everywhere in the world, right? If you see Indian Overseas Bank, the name tells it all. You have a variety of ways in which these links were connected. The first major multinational investment outside, arguably, is Aditya Birla Group's investment in Thailand. And it's interesting how that financing worked. Half that financing came from Indian Overseas Bank and an NRI merchant who happened to be a friend of that particular family. So without these Indian links in these regions, these first international connections of investments also would not have been possible. And so in a way, the story of Indian business and the story of India's international business is the story of the migration of particular communities. I end the chapter, of course, with the migration of new groups. So whether it's the Jats or the Marathas, different ways. If you look at the Patels in the diamond industry, if you look at the Gaundars in Tirupur, and a lot of new emerging communities who are also using migration and migrant networks to come up. Okay, but this is the converse story: is that many social groups have not moved The big story of this book is that while Indians have moved, not all Indians have moved in the same propensities, and that matters. And in this case, if you look at just the building up of diasporas, you don't really have a very big, for example, a Dalit diaspora which exists today. And I argue that that's one of the reasons why the sort of accumulation of capital, wealth, education, experience is stunted, is because of the lack of spatial mobility. And that is why migration is very important. This is just to give you an idea of one of the pictures from the Godrej archives. This is to show you how a passport looked like in the early 20th century. It's of Surab Perucha Godrej. And you'll see, at that time, we were all citizens of British India. So the front page of the passport, which is not on this picture, but it's there in the book, will say British India. And this is how, a passport would look like. But this is mentioned, the picture of this is there in the book. Now, I described the migration of labor and capital, and a lot of this was semi-permanent. Even the migration of business communities initially was not permanent. They would go back. So if you look at the grand Havelis in Rajasthan, in northern Rajasthan, the grand mansions in Chettinad even today, they were the result of people going out, the merchants going out, but not settling, also coming back. That changed over time among the rich. Even today, if you see caste-wise, the sort of upper castes have been more settled. I mean, they've settled more when they've gone out relative to the other castes. You can see this in Ratnagiri most famously. So the next chapter it's called Diasporas and Dreams. And I look at how different diasporas have sort of emerged, not only across the world, but more importantly within India. So when you think of the word diaspora, often we talk about the international diaspora, which is now more than 25 million Indians. But I argue that the internal diasporas, I measure this using sort of linguistic groups outside their home state, is more than double the size of the international diaspora. Right? And so it is this connection between the internal. So just to give you an idea, there are more Bengalis outside Bengal within India than outside. There are more Gujaratis outside Gujarat within India. There are more Gujaratis in South India than Gujaratis who are outside India. Right? So Gujaratis in Coimbatore, Gujaratis in Chennai. And this is a story which people have observed, but they have not really commented much upon. And so I draw these links as to how even in some cases the international diasporas have been built using these internal diasporas. The most famous diaspora, of course, the Malayali diaspora. And the Malayali diaspora, in a way, in the book mentions, has a record that is, its diaspora to local population ratio is more than 10%. Most other linguistic groups, it's about between 2, or let's say between 0 and 4%. So the Mallus are in a different bracket altogether when it comes to sort of migratory propensities. But I also talk about how these connections were forged, especially with the Gulf. One thing is to say that Kerala was always connected with the world. Vasco da Gama first went to Kerala and et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't explain how this craze for the oil, craze for the Gulf exactly started. And in the book, if you read it, it boils down to one, in a way, it boils down to one PWD engineer who just happened to have worked his entire life in India and was posted by the Anglo-Persian oil company. When they first struck oil in the world, the PWD engineer happened to have Indian experience. Right? And so what better labor than to get from India? And this first labor was not Keralites, they were North Indian, but I document then how the preference for Keralite labor came. But all of it started through Bombay. The major recruits to the Gulf were not from Kerala, they were from Bombay. But there were specific taboos on religion, etc., which meant that the Keralite diaspora of Bombay could leverage it. And then the HR outfit sort of moved down south, and they moved down to Kerala. And of course, today, a lot of people from Bombay go, a lot of people from Ratnagiri go to the Gulf, and all the West Coast, but Kerala sort of has a different propensity altogether. That story of settlement starts off with these sailors called Lascars, right? And in a way, the first diaspora of the US, the first guys who settled in the in US from India were the sailors who jumped off board and sort of mingled with the local population. So in New York, there's a whole sort of story of the Bengali Harlem. There's a lovely book which talks about this 19th century migration. In Britain, you might have seen this movie Victoria and Abdul, which is one connection of India and UK, but it's really the Lascars from the time of the East India Company. So if we're talking of 17th century, Indians have been going to the UK, mainly on ship, and some of them actually did stay back. Can you see that out here there are different labels like Burmese, Bengalis, Malay, Siamese, Surti, and Chinese, right? So different types of sailors. And for all these regions, in a way, the first diasporas were sort of created from these sailor networks. So that chapter, if you ever wanted to know why there's so many Mallus in the Gulf, why there's so many Punjabis in Canada, or why so many Gujaratis in UK, that's the chapter for you. I'm not going to go too much into that. But this is just to give you a chart of more recent migrations. It's this remarkable sort of photograph taken by Kaunteya Sinha. It's a fantastic photographer. And this is a photograph of just a head, practically, in what is Ayurveda spa chamber in, if I'm not mistaken, Estonia. And it's there in the book. And what's remarkable to me is that he's using the pressure cooker as a way to sort of, use this this spa. And I argue in the book, partly in wit, that for an Indian to sort of assimilate outside India, what are tests of assimilation? So in Britain, you have the Tebet test on cricket and so on. But the pressure cooker test is also very important, right? So practically every Indian who goes outside, I just went to Boston for 4 months and I had a pressure cooker in my suitcase. And if you can give up on your pressure cooker, that is giving a lot of your Indianness outside India. But there's a whole discussion there on assimilation, on the conflicts between generations of Desi children and non-Desi parents, and also Indian government policy to migrants. In a way, the Nehruvian paradigm was to stay away. When in Rome, let them do like the Romans do. This sort of changed in the 1980s. So because of the Chinese pressure, because Chinese were wooing the NRIs, Indians also decided to change. And by the 90s, you had clearly a sea change. And today we have a ministry, or at least we had a Ministry of Overseas and Indian Affairs. There's a Pravasi Bharati Divas. So there's a completely different engagement now of Indians with the outside sort of settled Indians population. There's a whole section out here on Mauritius, Fiji, the first people who went there. And what's interesting is how many of these identities are, of course, retained, but also many of them dissolve. Caste, for example, has dissolved considerably in many of these places. In the Punjabi diaspora, for example, most of them, so the Punjab is a core region of the Great Indian Migration Wave, but not all of Punjab. It's just 1 or 2 districts, like Hoshiarpur, Jalandhar, just a few districts. And that's how migration works. Typically, it's almost a few villages. There's a geographic barrier, maybe a hill, maybe a river. And once a network starts, practically everyone from that region is going out, and the other region has sort of stayed out. It could be a first recruitment agent who comes and starts this chain reaction. So in Punjab, not everyone is moving, but there's one cluster has been sending out people first in the British Army, of course, and then now just pretty much everywhere. I was working in Italy, and one of our projects was to track, Indian immigrants, and 200,000 pretty much Punjabi Indians in working the dairy sector of Italy. So if you ate cheese in Italy, it's been created with Indian hands. There's a very interesting Punjabi diaspora in Spain, and that is a Dalit Punjabi diaspora. So it's a completely different diaspora, and they have kind of shed off their initial identities, which they carried over from Punjab. So this is a chapter on diasporas and dreams. A lot of this migration that I've talked about so far has been on, in a way, permanent, or not permanent, but voluntary migration, right? But then you also have involuntary migration. And so there's a chapter called Partitions and Displacements. And I use partition in the plural. We are used to partition of 1947, but I argue that there were 3 partitions in the 20th century. And this is the first. This is the partition of Burma in 1937. And there were more than 500,000 refugees. I mean, even before the partition of 1947, India had a full-blown refugee crisis, which was in a way very useful to train civil service officers so that they knew what to do 5 years later when the actual partition happened. But the partition happened in 1937, but people started to really move in 1942 when the Japanese bombed Burma. And this is a still from that. And if you just saw the still without that line saying refugees leaving Mandalay, you might think this is an image from partition, right? Because these are the standard images that come out from partition. And I argue that the partition of Burma in 1937, India in 1947, and Pakistan in 1971, which led to the creation of Bangladesh, have had such deep ramifications for India in terms of either destroying wealth, changing trade routes, for example, locking the Northeast, which once Bangladesh was created, locked out the Northeast from economic ties, destroyed the Chettiars, who lost all their wealth in Burma, and also, changes which occurred on the West Coast. In terms of business history of Mumbai, a famous firm called Mahindra and Mohammed had started called M&M in 1945, but Mohammed left to go to Pakistan. So they had to fill in the extra M, so they call it Mahindra and Mahindra. Right? So that's one tidbit which comes from the history of Mumbai. Out here in this chapter, I argue that though these are the big events, it's actually the internal displacements, mainly due to the development-induced projects, which quantitatively have had a much larger impact and disproportionately large impact on particular communities, especially tribal communities. And so I look at the history of internal displacement in India from the first, when the railways were built, Land Acquisition Act, how did this act come, and what implication this has had till now. And I argue that actually in many paradoxical ways, those international displacements have got, in a way, almost better treatment than internal displacements, which are probably less known. This is a cartoon from R.K. Lakshman's, and there's a common man who's looking at this person who says, it's like a sort of a slum sort of an image, and there's one very well-painted big house, and he says, remember the carpenter who lived there? He's an NRI now. He had emigrated to the Gulf and is back. Right, so it's an image of what migration usually does. If you see, the first thing people do is paint their houses. It's an image of that you've arrived in a particular place. And so in the last chapter, I compare the sort of philosophies of, in a way, three important people, Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Bal Thackeray. And I argue that, they had very different attitudes on migration. Thackeray was more of a nativist. Ambedkar was a complete cosmopolitan. And Gandhi is somewhere in between. He's a cosmopolitan, but he also advocated fixity. He also advocated that ideally people should not be moving, right? Which is slightly at par with his own personal experience. And I use these three because all three are asking the same question. Who does migration benefit? Right? So Thackeray is saying, does it really benefit the Marathi Manus? And Ambedkar is saying, does it benefit the lower caste? And in his personal experience, it did, and that's why he was a very strong advocate of migration. And in a way, this is the burning question around the world today, whether it's from Trump's America or Brexit. All the concerns are over how many people should you admit, and what will these people do to your economies? And so this is a chapter on that where I look at various themes. It's called Migration and Development, tackle themes including brain drain, which was a major cry in India in the 60s and 70s, gender, trafficking, etc., etc. But the book ends pretty much on this note that in the future, a couple of things about where India is headed in terms of migration. First, I argue that the Great Indian Migration Wave, which in the 19th century went east towards Burma, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia, and in the 20th century went west in Delhi and Bombay and the Gulf, in the 21st century will go south. Right, which means that the biggest migrations which are going to happen in our lifetimes is going to be from North to South India. You've already seen it, in a sense, there are over 2 million North Indians now in Kerala, for example. But this is going to intensify because the South is aging much faster. And so just like Europe requires young hands to sort of meet the aging economy, South India is going to require much, much more labor from North India. Earlier, there was a linguistic difference. Now the wage differential is high enough for that to be sort of taken care of. Secondly, you have climate change as a major sort of concern, and here it's in a way very problematic for India because Bangladesh is one of the most hit regions, the low-lying region, which means if anything, you'll see more pressure from Bangladeshis to migrate into India. And as you know, there's a lot of talk anyways on Bangladeshi migration into India. And the third is, of course, India is going to see a much more much more migration of, in a way, the Western elite to India. Bombay was a much more cosmopolitan city 120 years back than it is today. And maybe you might see the return to that. So you're going to see many more white faces, black faces, different races coming back. And I argue that that's a good thing. And in a way, Indian history can be viewed as a product of a variety of migrations. Broadly, it's something to cherish. So in this book, I have basically few core arguments. I argue, A, that migration has not been low in Indian history. This idea of people not moving in history should be discarded. 2, India sustains the world's largest and longest migration anywhere, called the Great Indian Migration Wave, and I map out the geography, why it is happening, what is its impact. 3, not everyone is moving. Circulation is a big theme. People are not settling, and there are specific reasons for that. And because not everyone is moving, some groups are benefiting more, and the groups who are moving voluntarily are benefiting much more than the groups who are not. right? And so just to end with a particular statistic on urbanization, we say in India urbanization is 31%, but if you look at it among castes, Brahmins, it's almost 50%. So 31% is your all India average. But you have particular castes which are 50%. Then you have, another strata of what would we call as upper caste at 40%. Then you have the OBCs at pretty much the national average of 31%. And then you have the Dalits at 20%. And then the scheduled tribes at about 10%. And this is a story of historic migrations leading to different rates of urbanizations. And we know that, there's huge benefits from living in a city. And that is why, though you might think that Bombay is a big city, just like the mayor of 1885, 1885, not 1985, 1885 exhorted people to stop coming to Bombay because it's getting too populated. You should also know that the city of Bombay is actually losing people. The island population of Bombay actually fell between 2001 and 11 as per the census. Think twice before cursing migrants. A lot of social groups still have to come up through migration, as many other social groups have done in the past. So this was the process of writing the book. This was the first page of the book in the laptop with a lot of books around it. And finally, this is what you have in your hands, which is behind you. So I'll end here. Thank you.